Good evening and welcome. Come have a seat, please. Come have a seat, please. Come sit. So delighted to welcome everyone back. I hope that nobody lives in Castaic. And if you do, you're welcome to sleep here tonight. Because that really scary fire there now. But we're delighted. This is sort of our first event back since the catastrophe of the fires. And I'm so glad that we're here and we're well. I want to offer a very special welcome to Jess and Lil Bime, who just got back into their home, thank God, and are well and made it. If you turned on your TV, you could see Jess out there fighting the fire, and you did a fine job, so thank you. I'm just glad you're here, and I want to welcome back my friend Harvey Myman from the depths. Welcome back, and it's so good to have you back in the world of the living. It's really wonderful, and everyone else, welcome back. I hope that you're safe, your home is safe, your family is safe. If there are people in your acquaintance who are in need, who have lost homes, need some help, there's a tremendous amount of resources in the community, in the synagogue, in the Jewish community. Just give us a call and let us know. And we're here to help in any way we can. And if you're just feeling shaky, because the world just seems a little shaky, you can come by and we can talk. And that's what we're here to help with. So everybody come find a seat. Couple of quick announcements while they're getting seats set up. The sessions, this one next week and the week after, are not going to be streamed, but they are going to be recorded. And in a day or two after the session, they'll post the recordings. The recordings of the last course, the one I did with Steve Windmuller on the American Jewish Century, were just posted this afternoon. So if you didn't get a chance to see any of those lectures, they really were quite remarkable and wonderfully learned. And you're welcome to go online and pick those up. And these will be up also after the session's over. We sort of wanted you to come together because it's sort of nice to be together. So we're not going to Zoom this. We're going to just actually do it the old-fashioned way, to actually be with each other and learn together. Couple of other announcements. This Sunday, the Seva and Hazak are having Walk with the Rabbi. I think it's 9 o'clock at the lake. Yeah, 9 o'clock at Lake Balboa, which is just up here on Balboa. You drive in, as soon as you cross the bridge, park, and just at the bend of the lake, we'll all meet and we'll take a walk around the lake and talk about big things, and it's a lovely way. If it's a nice day, it's a nice way. If the air's too polluted, we won't do it, but if it's clear, it's a nice way to start your week with a walk around the lake. The following Sunday, which I think is February the 2nd, Cantor Raffi is putting on a beautiful concert. The traditional Jewish music of Velvel Disney. So you're all welcome to come and celebrate Broadway shows and Disney tunes, and with a wonderful group of young cantors who will come to entertain us, and everyone is invited to do that. As well, come hang out at the shul. It feels good to be around folks. This is College of Jewish Studies, Valley Beth Shalom College of Jewish Studies, where we learn Judaism on a university level without the tests, sororities, or football games. And we're delighted that you're here. As is our custom, please stand up, turn around, say hello to the folks that are here, and tell them it's damn good to see you. Now, before you sit down, because you're going to be sitting for a very long time, stand up, put your arms around each other. We're all heavily vaccinated. We can do this. And we make two blessings for the chance to be together and to learn Torah together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shechianu v'kiyamanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh. Amen. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. Please be seated. The philosopher Sidney Hook, who taught at New York University and was Rabbi Schulweis's philosophical teacher, his master's thesis advisor, the philosopher Sidney Hook published a teeny little book, very important book called The Hero in History. And he asked and tried to analyze the question that is at the heart of historiography. Do the times make the hero, or does the hero make the times? Do the times shape a hero, raise up a hero for that moment, and it's really the context? Any other context, the hero would not be a hero? Or does the hero shape the times? Hook comes down firmly on the side of the hero. He says, historical moments present possibilities, but it takes a unique soul to be able to perceive those possibilities and act in the way that is needed at that moment. And he points to various examples of this: Winston Churchill, Thomas Jefferson. Harold Schulweis was one of these people. Harold Schulweis had a unique ability, a prophetic ability, to see the times we're living in. He didn't see the future, and he certainly understood the past from his scholarship. But what he could see was the world we were living in, and he understood the narratives that controlled that world. And he could perceive the gaps, the problems in those narratives. And he pledged himself to fixing it by offering us new narratives. Schulweis was renowned for the programs that he would introduce. He came to Shul every Yontiv, every Rosh Hashanah, and he would give a long sermon in which he would introduce this year's new initiative. Chavurot, para-rabbinics, a counseling center, caring, connect, all kinds of things, all kinds of initiatives. But the truth of the matter is, his genius wasn't in coming up with the programs. His genius, God knows, wasn't in making those programs real. That was my job. His genius was the narrative. It's almost like the program isn't as important. The program was simply a syringe for injecting a new narrative into the life of the Jewish people at that moment. That's what his genius was. This April will be his 100th birthday. And so in celebration of his centennial, I thought it'd be nice to do what we really ought to do for scholars, which is go back and read them again. So we're going to spend 3 evenings together, these next 3 Wednesday nights. And in a rough sense, we'll follow the tradition's understanding of God, Torah, and Israel. Tonight, we're going to talk about his perception of the Jewish people. Next week, we're going to talk about his perception of divinity of God, especially after the Holocaust. And the third time, we'll talk about his perception of Judaism and what Judaism needs to do and needs to know. Let's begin with the man. Born April 14th, 1925 in the Bronx. The Bronx was the most intensely Jewish neighborhood in America. The Bronx was where Shalom Aleichem, the great Yiddish writer, was buried. The Bronx was where Bess Meyerson, the first Jewish Miss America, was born. The Bronx was intensely Jewish neighborhood. And Harold is born into this neighborhood. His father, Maurice, Moshe, immigrant from Poland, was a very unsuccessful tea and coffee salesman. His father, however, was not religious. His father was raised religious in Poland, but he had an incident when he was a kid. There was a woman, very, very poor woman, selling apples on a Friday afternoon on the block where the synagogue was, and Maurice Schulweis, his father, Harold's grandfather, walked up to this woman, screamed at her, and knocked over her cart. And Maurice decided religion was for fanatics. Never accepted the fact that his son became a rabbi. Never. Instead, he was a Yiddishist. Now, this is a kind of Jew you don't have anymore. But once upon a time, there was a great movement that celebrated Jewish culture through the Yiddish language. He was a follower of a philosopher named Chaim Zhidlovsky, who unfortunately is only very, very little is translated because he wrote in this beautiful literary Yiddish. And Zhidlovsky basically believed in the Jewish people and its culture and wanted to revive the Jewish people and its culture through the medium of Yiddish language. The Schulweis home was a salon where Yiddish writers and actors and poets and thinkers and columnists would gather to give readings and papers and share their intellectual life. This is the milieu in which Harold was raised. His mother was raised in a Hasidic family and rebelled against her parents to marry this secular Yiddishist. And together they made a life. They were very, very poor, living in the Bronx. Schulweis went to public school, and he had never been in a synagogue until his 11th year. When he was 11 years old, Rosh Hashanah fell out on a weekday, and because the schools were 90% Jewish, the public schools let off that day, and he had nothing to do, as every 11-year-old did. He was wandering the neighborhood, and he saw a bunch of really nicely dressed people going into a building, so he followed them in. And he was a little kid, so they sent him upstairs. They figured he was a little kid looking for his mother. And he sat in the first row of the women's section of this synagogue, staring down through the fence, through the little separator, listening to the service. And he became terribly entranced with this. And he ran home. And he told his mother that he found this incredible place where the music was beautiful and the stories were engaging. And it was this incredible place called a shul. And his mother realized that there was something terribly important to this young man's life that was missing from his experience. So she took him right over to her father, Abraham Rizak. Abraham Rizak was a Belzer Chassid. He was a deeply religious man. He didn't work. His wife worked. His kids worked. But he stayed home and learned all day long. And Zayda, as Harold called him, Abraham Rizak, took this young man under his wing and began to teach him Torah, began to teach him religious Judaism. When he hit the 7th grade, because of his grandfather's influence, they pulled him out of the public school and sent him to the Salanter Yeshiva, which his father wouldn't accept, but the grandfather supported. So you had a sort of triangle here between the father, the grandfather, the mother, and the kid. Schulweis had his bar mitzvah at a small shtibel in the Bronx in 1938, and he gave his bar mitzvah speech in 3 languages. He gave it in Yiddish for his father, in English for his mother, and in Hebrew for his grandfather. And that's an emblem of his identity. Frankly, it's an emblem of the identity of that generation, which was new to America and trying to figure out, what do you do here? What does it mean to be a Jew in America? His mother wanted him to be an American. His grandfather wanted him to be a religious Jew, and his father wanted him to be a Yiddish socialist. No wonder he was mixed up. He goes to the Salanter Yeshiva, graduates with honors, because at the Salanter Yeshiva, he was taught by refugees from Europe, and they were gentle. He experienced a gentle orthodoxy, which he always maintained respect for the rest of his life. Unlike other people in his ilk, he was never anti-Orthodox. He was instead, he had a real love of traditional Judaism, because the traditional Judaism that he met first at his grandfather's table and then in the yeshiva was a gentle, loving orthodoxy. When he graduated, he went on to Yeshiva College, and he started an undergraduate program at Yeshiva University, Yeshiva College. He got a student deferment. There were 72 men who graduated in his, all men, who graduated in his class. The first published work of Harold Schulweis was a 2-page essay that was published in his college yearbook. 12 of the 72 men were asked to write essays for the college yearbook. And he wrote an essay, this was now 1940. He wrote an essay on the limits of religious tolerance. The question was, the Allies having won the war in Japan, it was 1945, sorry. He got in 1940, he finished 1945. Having won the war in Japan, do they have an obligation to tolerate and support the Japanese religions that supported the emperor and his program of imperialism. And Schulweis's answer, which I found reverberated through the rest of his life, was, you can judge a religion. The truth of a religion is the kind of ethical people it creates. The truth of a religion can be judged and measured and weighed by the ethics it teaches and the ethics of its adherents. And inasmuch as this Japanese religion had led to a world war in the Pacific, we had no obligation to protect it. Now, that idea that the truth of a religion is contained in the ethics of its adherents, or as he'll say later on in his life, religion is behaved, not believed. Religion is behaved. God is behaved. That's going to be the resonant theme of the rest of his theology. He finished school 1945, June of 1945, graduated top of his class, and had no idea what to do next. No idea what to do next. Some of his classmates were staying at Yeshiva University to become rabbis. Some were going elsewhere to become lawyers and doctors. And Schulweis had no idea what to do until he saw an article in the New York Times. And the article in the New York Times told this story. There was a renegade rabbi, renegade Orthodox rabbi, by the name of Mordechai Kaplan, who had written a new Haggadah and had taken out of the Haggadah all of the nationalist themes that sounded really racist, that didn't belong, in his judgment, in Judaism after the war, and had written a modern version of the Haggadah. And the Orthodox rabbinate, the Orthodox Rabbinical Council of New York, gathered in the lobby of the McAlpin Hotel in Manhattan to burn Mordechai Kaplan's Haggadah and to excommunicate Mordechai Kaplan. This was months after the Nazis were burning Jewish books. And this was a group of Orthodox rabbis burning another Orthodox rabbi's book because they realized they thought it was a threat to the continuity and authenticity of Judaism. And Schulweis had only one thought: I got to meet this guy. So he went to seminary. Came down, he was in the Bronx. He came down to JTS, which is 122nd Street and Broadway in Morningside Heights, made an appointment to meet Kaplan, and they became close friends for the rest of their lives. I have in my office the file of correspondence, which I found in the rabbi's files between him and Mordechai Kaplan, that started then and ended the year Mordechai Kaplan died at the age of 103. They kept this correspondence going back and forth for all those years. Schulweis decided this is a man whose example I have to follow, so he came to JTS and he enrolled at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary of the conservative movement, to become a rabbi. He didn't like it. He didn't like it because it wasn't a terribly intellectual place, and he was used to an intellectual life. So at the same time that he was enrolled at JTS, he went downtown to NYU and enrolled in a philosophy program there with Sidney Hook, who was Jewish by birth, but was a renegade Jew as well. So if the first triangle that formed Schulweis's character was Papa and Grandpa, the second triangle that will form his intellectual life is Mordechai Kaplan and Sidney Hook. And ironically, both of them were students of the great American philosopher John Dewey. Mordechai Kaplan took John Dewey's philosophy of pragmatism and applied it to Judaism and created Reconstruction. Reconstruction is Judaism. He even got the name from it. John Dewey's principal book of philosophy is called Reconstruction in Philosophy. And Mordechai Kaplan called his movement Reconstructionist. Sidney Hook took John Dewey's pragmatism and turned it into a form of economic socialism, a kind of Marxist pragmatism, don't ask, but ferociously anti-religious. And both of them competed for the soul of this young man. There's an entry in Sidney Hook's autobiography where he's talking about he was at a dinner where he was seated next to Louis Finkelstein, who was the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And Sidney Hook told Louis Finkelstein, listen, I have to apologize to you because I'm about to steal one of your best students and bring him down to my side. And Finkelstein said, we'll put up a fight for him. And that was Schulweis. Because Sidney Hook was ready to give him a PhD in philosophy and send him to City College to teach philosophy. And Louis Finkelstein wanted him to stay and become a rabbi and serve the Jewish people. And this is the pull on this. He's going to rebel against both of them. I'll tell you the end of the story in a minute. At a Purim dance in 1945, he met a beautiful 17-year-old girl named Muriel Savod, and fell crazy in love with this girl. He had no money. His father was really poor, and whatever pennies he had, he was paying the seminary. He's living at home. He didn't even have shoes. The story is that when he went to pick up Muriel Savod, later Malka Savod, his shoes were held together he had string wrapped around his shoes and a piece of cardboard under the shoe to cover the hole in the sole. And her father looked at him and turned to her and said, what is he, an orphan? This is the boy you're dating? Because Malka had a very big family. She had all these uncles who were doing very, very well. Malka was a brilliant young girl. She was going to Hunter College High School at the time and used to stop and go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, spend her afternoons at the Met, and then come home. They met at a Purim dance. The first date was at the Automat. Anybody remember the Automat? For those of you of another generation, you put in a quarter, you open a little door, and there was something to eat. He took her to the Automat, gave her 2 quarters, and said, have anything you'd like. Social conventions and social politeness was not his strong suit. By the second date, remember, she's 17 and he's 21. By the second date, he said, let's get married. And she said, I barely know you. And he said, you will, you will. 6 months later, they were engaged. And 6 months after that, they were married at the Park Avenue Synagogue by Rabbi Morris Kurtzer. And as the rabbi of the ceremony was reading the ketubah, his grandfather kept correcting the pronunciation. Schulweis graduated from JTS and from NYU. He wrote the first English language master's thesis on Martin Buber's philosophy. He was very critical of Buber. Buber was coming through New York on his way to LA to give some lectures. Schulweis found out about this. So he sent a telegram to Buber asking if he could meet him in New York. He met him in New York in the lobby of the hotel where Buber was staying, gave him a copy of the dissertation, of the master's thesis, chatted for a little while. Buber then went to LA. On the way back, Buber cabled him and said, meet me, I have some comments for you. I have that page upstairs also. Buber handed him back the book and said, if you hate me so much, why did you bother writing about me? Because he was a rationalist, and Buber was much more of a mystic. Later on, as we'll talk in a minute, he found Buber again. He graduated in 1950. And the seminary had a policy of sending rabbis off to communities that needed them. And they sent him off to Parkchester in the Bronx. And he was the youth director in a small synagogue there for 2 years. Harold Schulweis was the youth director in a synagogue. Just if you remember him, that's a very funny sentence. After 2 years, he was ready to leave. He and Malka had gotten married. They were ready to start a family. She was actually pregnant with Ethan already. And he applied for placement. In those days, they placed you. And by now, he had made his reputation as a troublemaker, as a rebel, just like his teacher, Mordecai Kaplan. So they decided the best place to put him, far away from New York, someplace where he couldn't make trouble for anybody, Oakland, California. Which is as far away from New York as you can get. If you take a ruler and a globe, you'll see. And they sent him to Beth Abraham in Oakland, California. He was 26 years old. Young, it was 1952. He was 26 years old, newly married with a pregnant wife, and he began working. The first thing he did in that synagogue, don't listen to this, he fired the cantor. First thing he did, because he felt that the cantor didn't bring anything, and he found a new one, a younger person. And he began preaching. He would preach 3 times a weekend, Friday night, Saturday morning, and then Sunday morning breakfast. He was so effective. He was so intellectually stimulating. He was so timely that the place became a magnet. There were all these young families moving into the neighborhood after the war, and people from Berkeley campus would flock to go hear him. And he built this place into a powerhouse. By the time he left, they had 600 families, the biggest that synagogue has ever been in its history. It was a remarkable time. Now, what happened when Harold Schulweis was far away? Well, you remember what happened to the Bay Area in the 50s and the 60s? The 50s were relatively quiet, but the 60s, right? You have the student movement on the Berkeley campus beginning in 1964, followed by the counterculture rising up in San Francisco. His kids knew lots of those kids. His kids came home. Ethan and Seth came home. He had 3 kids, Ethan, Seth, and Alyssa. Ethan and Seth came home and they said, Dad, the hippies of Haight-Ashbury, Dad, they're all Jewish. So Schulweis went down there to investigate, and sure enough, so he rented the basement of the Metropolitan Church at Haight-Ashbury, went to the Jewish Federation of San Francisco, and asked for a few dollars to put on a Pesach Seder. And they told him, nah, Rabbi, those long-haired, drug-smoking, Grateful Dead listening, they're not Jewish. So instead he went to the Sisterhood of Temple Beth Abraham, got them to cook a Seder, went to put up posters all over the neighborhood, right? It was the summer of love in 67. This was the Pesach of love in April 67. He expected 20, 30 kids. 200 kids showed up. They crowded into the basement, and he walked around giving out parts in a Haggadah. He went to one young man who had very long hair, beads and tie-dye, and he said, do you know Haggadah? And the guy said, of course I know Haggadah. You want it with drums or without? And Schulweis stood up on a table, and he led a Seder for 200 Haight-Ashbury hippies, who to this day would, among them, by the way, was Bill Graham, who was the owner and organizer of Fillmore East and West. He was the great rock and roll impresario. And they maintained, whose name wasn't Bill Graham, it was this long Polish name. He was a Jew. And they maintained a relationship. The other interest, and by the way, the sermon he gave at that Seder was, he looked at these kids and he said, I respect what you're doing. Because just like Moses rebelled against Pharaoh, you're rebelling against the bourgeois values of your parents. Go for it. He approved of them, and they loved him for it. Then, at the same time, this was the rise of the civil rights movement and the rise of black power. And where did the Black Panther Party begin? In Oakland, California. Harold was the only white person on the board of the NAACP in Oakland. And when the Black Power movement started, they regretfully told him that he couldn't have a part because he was a white Jew, and they wanted African American, wanted black people. But they did one thing for him, which was critical. Critical for him, critical for them, and critical for this place. They took him on a driving tour of the Oakland ghetto. His African American friends from the NAACP and the Black Panther Party, they took him on a driving tour, and they pointed out all of the tenements that were owned by members of his synagogue, and the pawn shops that were owned by members of his synagogue, and the liquor stores that were owned by members of his synagogues. So he gave a sermon, and he called them out by name. He called them out. They were sitting in the first 3 rows of the shul because they were the donors. He called them out by name. And he said, there's a time when you need to get out. And this is the time to get out. To get out of that business of tenements, to get out of that business of pawn shops, because there was a rising consciousness of black anti-Semitism in the late 60s. And he said, no wonder they hate us. We own the tenements. We exploit them in the liquor stores. We exploit them in the pawn shops. They hate us, and they have reason to hate us. Well, he was right. But that's not good for career longevity. Because following that sermon, the board of directors of Temple Beth Abraham got to him and said, it's time to think about leaving. It's time to think about leaving. Now, by the way, I met with them. to interview them for my research. They regret that decision. He started looking. He looked in Dallas, Texas. He looked in Kansas City. And David Lieber, who was the president of the UJ at the University of Judaism, invited him to come look here. And he came down here and he found something here at Valley Beth Shalom that was an opportunity. Because this was a notoriously underperforming congregation at the time. LA had burgeoned, had grown incredibly large. The Jewish community here had doubled and doubled and doubled again. And by 1970, the community was huge, but there was one major congregation in the San Fernando Valley, and that was what was then called VJCC. Now it's called Adat Ariel, and Rabbi Wise was the rabbi there. I grew up in a synagogue on this end of the valley that was small and cozy and wonderful. But this place was notoriously underperforming. And he decided this was a place he wanted to come to. So he came here, and his first sermon was on Slichot, 1970. And I can tell you that I was there. The room was filled. There's 1,500 people stuffed into that room to hear the new rabbi. And the extraordinary thing about that moment was what he said and what he didn't say. Now, those of you who remember, in 1967, when Israel won the Six-Day War, that was a revolution not only in the Middle East, but a revolution here for American Jews, because it really was the birth of Jewish pride. After 1967, we started wearing yarmulkes out. After 1967, we became visible. Until 1967, Jews were very invisible. It was dangerous to be visible. But after 1967, Jewish pride began to bubble. But alongside Jewish pride was a new concern for Jewish survival. Because almost like the near-death experience of the 1967 war awakened something within the Jewish heart that if we would have lost that war, something horrendous would have happened to the Jewish people, another Holocaust. And the idea that we could disappear became fused in the American Jewish mind. And from 1967 on, the watchword of the community was Jewish survival and Jewish continuity. Alongside of that was this incredible sociological phenomenon. The birth rate of the United States doubled. You know, the birth rate is measured by number of kids per woman. The birth rate before the Second World War was 1.7 children per woman. In other words, we were below replacement. What was the birth rate in 1950? 3.77 children per woman. I have 3 younger brothers, and we always joke that the youngest one is that 0.77. Right? I mean, look, this was called the baby boom. The second phenomenon was, having gone and trained in sunny climates, GIs came back from the war and decided they didn't want to come back to freezing cold tenements in Chicago and New York and Detroit. They wanted to live in sunny climates, and this is when Florida and California exploded. The San Fernando Valley was the fastest growing neighborhood in America through the 1950s. The population doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled. So when he came to Valley Beth Shalom in 1970, he was facing an incredibly young congregation full of people who had left their families in New York and Philadelphia and Detroit and come here and didn't have extended families and were looking for a connection and looking for something and looking for identity. But the thing was that what synagogues were doing at this point was catering to kids. They invented something called family services, which started an hour early and included a nice story from the rabbi. And the cantors wanted to be relevant, so they played the guitar and sang prayers to Simon and Garfunkel songs. And that was considered Judaism. It was a deeply juvenile Judaism. Rabbis were supposed to talk about how we need to be committed to the Jewish future. And they would demand of the congregation a pledge to continue and to become more observant and more affiliated. No one did it, but they listened. That's what rabbis were supposed to do. Rabbis were supposed to talk in an idiom that was accessible to children. Rabbis were supposed to talk about children. Rabbis were supposed to condemn intermarriage. Schulweis did none of that. In fact, he so purposely did none of it, it was a shock. The first thing he did was talk in a vocabulary that was distinctly grown-up. We used to joke that when you joined VBS, you got a philosophical dictionary, just so you could follow words like teleological and axiological and metaphysical. And more, he talked in an adult vocabulary because he believed that the only way to get young people, children, to affiliate with Judaism and observe its customs and ceremonies was to show them grown-ups who were doing that and to offer grown-ups a Judaism. He talked in an idiom that was grown-up, in words that were grown-up, and in concepts that were grown-up because he realized something. And here's his first perception of narrative. He realized that his teacher, Mordechai Kaplan, was wrong. Well, not know someone wrong. Kaplan was right. Kaplan's great invention was the idea that for Orthodox traditional Judaism, historically traditional Judaism, it was a matter of believing and behaving and then belonging. What made you a Jew? You believed in God, you believed that the Torah was true, you kept the mitzvot, and you belonged to the community. Kaplan realized that for modern Jews, believing was very difficult because science had shaken the foundations of Jewish belief. Kaplan believed that behaving as a Jew is very difficult because we're assimilated into America and we have new patterns of behavior. So for Kaplan, the most important thing was belonging. Kaplan talked about being a member of the Jewish people. That was primary. And that became the primary principal philosophy of American non-Orthodox Judaism. When I grew up, I had a rabbi who never talked about God. He was a deeply religious man. I knew that privately because I knew him very well because he was a lovely, lovely, wonderful soul. But he never talked about God. He talked about the Jewish people, about Jewish education, about assimilation, about intermarriage, about Jewish survival, about Jewish continuity, occasionally about Israel. Being a member of the Jewish people, for my rabbi, was the most important thing. For most rabbis, it was the most important thing. That worked in 1920 and 1930 and 1940 and even in 1950 when Kaplan taught. But by 1970, Schulweis realized there was something wrong with that. Because if all you have is belonging, and there is no foundation or in belief or in behavior, what you end up with is shallow, hollow, ethnic Judaism. Bagels and lox, fiddler on the roof, a few Yiddish expressions, a few Yiddish affectations, ethnic identity with no foundation in truth. And Schulweis felt that was fatal to the Jewish people. And so he decided to bring us something which we had never heard. Judaism. A truth, a set of truths, metaphysical truths and moral truths, religious truths, a set of beliefs that would reorganize your life. And on the basis of those beliefs, a new way of living your life. That was the new narrative that he brought that night in 1970. The problem the community saw, the narrative that had gripped the community, was that we were losing Jews because of the forces of assimilation and secularization and alienation and disaffiliation. In 1964, 6 years before, Look magazine, which at the time was the second most popular news magazine in America after only Life magazine, Look magazine published a cover article called The Vanishing American Jew. And what had happened is Thomas Morgan, who was the senior editor, gathered in all of the extant sociological data about Jews and showed that with rising rates of intermarriage and lower rates of identity and lower rates of affiliation, Jewish survival in America was really threatened. And he evoked another principle. There was a guy named Hansen, who's a sociologist in Hartford, who studied Swedish immigrants in the northern Midwest and discovered that American ethnic groups last 3 generations. The first generation comes from the old country, and they maintain an affiliation with their language and customs and dress and ways of life. The second generation is ambivalent. They live in America, they want to be part of America, but they're loyal to their parents as well and their parents' culture. By the third generation, Grandparents can speak Yiddish or Vietnamese or Spanish or whatever, but the kids really don't take seriously that culture anymore. It becomes a kind of kitsch. And by the fourth generation, they disappear altogether. They intermarry and they blend into America. Well, Morgan said in 1964, American Jews are now reaching their third generation. By 1980, there'll be almost no Jews left in America, and by the turn of the millennium, there will be no Jews left in America. This became something that the community fastened on and became an ideology. Federations began funding day schools and summer camps and Hebrew schools. Hebrew schools began to burgeon because people were worried, not about their own Judaism, but about their children's Judaism. That's one of the great ironies of the thing. My parents didn't come to shul, but they made damn sure that I went to Hebrew school, right? You dropped off your kids and then went off to, it wasn't Costco then, it was Fedco, right? And Gemco. You went off shopping, and then you picked up the kids after Hebrew school, right? That's what we did. We were carpool Judaism. I thought carpool was a Hebrew word. Carpool, carpalti, carpalnu, anachnu carpulnu. I mean, I really thought carpool was a Hebrew word because I spent my life in carpools going to Hebrew school and then Hebrew High and then USY. There was a program, I don't know how many of you were at USY. There was a program, and I know this because it was here because Merrill Alpert used to do it all the time. It was a horror. There was a reading that was circulated called The Last American Jew. You get the kids in a circle with a candle, and somebody reads this thing, and the guy says, "Here I sit in the year 2005, in an exhibit at the Smithsonian, I am the last American Jew." And it was this mournful, lachrymose crying, and at the end we're all in tears. I promise I'll come to Shul Shabbos, I'll only date Jews, I promise. This was the ideology, and Schulweis saw this, and he saw that it was wrong. First of all, the culture wasn't becoming more secular. If anything, it was becoming more religious, but the religions of the culture of the time were secular religions. There were all of these self-help cults. Anybody remember Est? You remember Est? There was you can't even describe it. It was a self-help cult. Can I say that? Is that fair enough? I mean, there were religious cults. There were Moonies and Hare Krishnas. And then there was Est, there was Synanon, there was Daytop, I think it was called. There were a bunch of these, all these organizations, and people would go. There was a thing called Rolfing, where they would jump on your back and make you scream, and that was supposed to make you a better human being. Primal Scream, remember this? Remember, the 1970, this is when self-help books, I'm okay, you're okay. Also, The Sensuous Woman and the Sensuous Man, which I had, but don't tell my mother, right? I mean, this focus on self. That's where Schulweis found the answer. It wasn't that people were becoming more assimilated. It wasn't that people were becoming more secular. It wasn't that people were willy-nilly disaffected from Judaism because they didn't like to be Jewish. They actually wanted to be Jewish. But they were asking questions that the synagogue couldn't answer because the synagogue wasn't ready to answer those questions. He found the answer, a theory of what was happening to his community in the writings of a social scientist named Philip Rieff. Philip Rieff taught social science at the University of Pennsylvania for many years and published a series of very important books focusing on Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst. And he was interested in what does psychology mean in a culture? And in the end of one of his books, it's called Freud, the Mind of the Moralist, at the end of the book, he introduces a character called the psychological man. I gave you some excerpts from it. So let's take a look at some of these excerpts because you'll understand Schulweis if you understand Philip Rieff. Ready? These are just quotations. The psychological man of the 20th century is a child of nature, not of nature, but of technology. He is not the pagan ideal, the political man. He's not committed to public life, and he's most unlike religious man. All right, now what is he saying? Once upon a time, in ancient Greece, the character type that everyone wanted to be, that we aspired to be, was the political person. To be a member of the Greek polis, to participate in the deliberations of the city, to feel a part of a community, and to contribute your wisdom and resources to the community. That was ancient Greece. In medieval Europe, it was to be religious man. The principal character was to be part of the church and commit your resources, material and personal resources, to the church. You were committed to the church. The biggest building, the biggest architectural feature of a Greek city was the agora, or the forum, where the political class met. In the medieval city, the greatest architectural feature was the cathedral, where the community met in prayer and in meditation. You come to modernity, the biggest feature in a city is the factory. Economic man. Economic man who is no longer sees himself as part of a political or a religious community. He's in it for himself. He wants to make it. He wants to be successful. And he measures all of his activities on a cost-benefit standard. How much does it cost me and what do I get out of it? What does it profit me? But then, in late modernity, said Reif, economic man gives rise to psychological man. What Sigmund Freud did was signal the fact that now you conduct all of your life business on the basis of, what does it get me? What does it get me? That cost-benefits analysis, it's all interjected about me. It's about me. I want to be satisfied. I want to be happy. I want to be comfortable. What's in it for me? Should I get married? Only if it's good for me. Should I join a community? Only if it's good for me. But psychological man, says Reif, is suspicious of community because communities tend to impose claims on you. And the claims on the self diminish the freedom of the self. And so psychological man is averse to joining anything. He's averse to joining anything. It's a limited liability contract. I will come and be part of something, but only as long as I can control the transaction. In other words, psychological man enters into every social relationship like a consumer. What am I buying? I had a kid who came to me wanting to get married. I said, great. I said, I met a wonderful, wonderful girl. I said, wonderful. Tell me about her. Well, Rabbi, he says, she checks all of my boxes. And I put my pen down. I said, you're not ready to get married. Let me think about it. She checks all of my boxes. What does that mean? Like, I went shopping, and I had a list, and my God, almost all of them are checked, right? And I'm going to marry her, because she's, unless I find a better one tomorrow and checks more of mine, then I'll get rid of her, and I'll trade up. It's like a lease, right? 3 years, I'll turn her back in and get a new one, right? Right? That's the attitude of psychological men. Schulweis looks at his community, looks at us here at VBS, and he discovers these are psychological Jews. Once upon a time, there were religious Jews, like his grandfather, who were committed to God and Torah and Israel, who defined themselves by the community. He tells a story that when his grandmother died, she died 2 days before Sukkot. So she died, and they had 2 days of Shiva, and then Shiva ends with the holiday. Because the community's need to celebrate overcomes the private need to mourn. And his grandfather didn't complain, because that's the way it works. You live within the community is your immortality, life is about giving to the community, God is found in the community, and so his grandfather was fully devoted to the community. His father was an ideological Jew. He wasn't committed to the religious community, he was committed to the socialist Yiddishist community. And he would do anything for the Jewish people. He would fight for the Jewish people. He would try to create a new world for the Jewish people. But the people who sat in front of Schulweis in 1970 were neither religious nor ideological. They were in it for themselves. They were psychological Jews. Look at the second section here. We are confronted with a new character ideal, with a radically different kind of Jew, the newest sociological phenomenon in our history. We face the emerging psychological Jew. The psychological Jew is sui generis, that means unique. He is radically different from the other familiar types. He is on principle a privatist. What does privatist mean? Me and mine, right? A consumer of religious experience, basically. For this post-religious, post-ideological Jew, all community is suspect. For this post-religious, post-ideological Jew, all community is suspect. He may not have read Freud or Marcuse or Brown, but a meta-psychology has filtered down to warn him that civilization is regressive. Psychological wisdom counsels that community, whether in the shape of religious faith or political ideology, robs him of his private satisfactions, his privacy, and his individualism. In our times, the danger to ourselves comes from the suffocating demands of the community, and while the community is in part useful, it must be kept at a safe distance, lest it drain our energies and desiccate our joys. And he points out, what's the best example of this? I don't mean to hurt anybody's feelings here, so don't get mad at me. I'm quoting Schulweis. I don't believe any of this. The private bar mitzvah. Rabbi, I don't want to come to shul on a Shabbos and celebrate my child's coming of age with all of these strangers. Why should I buy a kiddush meal for all of these strangers? I want my child to be the center of attention. So you have a bar mitzvah in the afternoon, which is okay. Halakhically, that's acceptable. But it means there's no community. Only the Jew, the family, and a few friends, and the friends. And Jessica, or Jennifer, or Jared, or Justin is the center of attention. And Jessica or Jared does their Haftorah, the Torah portion, and plays something on the violin or on the piano, or does a tap dance and gives a speech, and it's my rabbi celebrating my child with my family, and then we have our party. And in big lights, it's, Justin or Jefferson or whatever his name is, right? Right? And Schulweis says, you understand, of course, that's the exact opposite of what a bar mitzvah is. A bar mitzvah means you're initiating a child into a sitting community of people who pray and learn and celebrate life together. That's what a bar mitzvah is by definition. Take it out of the community, make it a private thing. You no longer have a bar mitzvah, you have the Jewish equivalent of a piano recital. But that's what the psychological Jew wants. My rabbi, in my synagogue, for my child and my family, to celebrate my success as a parent. Now, where does this come from, says Schulweis? It comes from the culture we're living in, except for one small problem. We Jews, well, you know the expression, Jews are like everybody, only more so. We Jews took this bourgeois culture of consumerism, and we put it on steroids. And he talks about the middle-class Jewish family and the pressures on that kid. The pressures, he once had a beautiful, it's here in the next section. He said, the Jewish child experiences a uniquely Jewish form of child abuse. It's called disappointment. The Jewish child is told, I only want you to work up to your potential. Problem is, what the hell does that mean? Like, there's no such thing as a potential. Whenever you get close to it, then your potential's beyond that. In other words, the Jewish child has come to learn that unless he gets straight A's, plays first violin in the orchestra as the captain of the soccer team, and gets into University of Pennsylvania, not really loved. And when a kid realizes that, they go someplace where they're loved. The Moonies would love you. I remember that. The Hare Krishna guys really loved me. They made good food, too. The Jews for Jesus would love you. Est would teach you how to survive that, not love you, but they'll, the psychological and religious cults of the 70s and 80s offered what the Jewish family was not offering. And the problem was the synagogue couldn't offer it either. The synagogue couldn't offer it either. Look at the second page. Look at the bottom before we get to the synagogue, before we get to the answer. These are all sections taken from sermons and articles that he wrote. And I can give you the references if you need. Cries the contemporary Jew, help me. Pay attention to my personal life. I am falling apart. Stop telling me what I can do for the sake of Judaism, for the sake of the synagogue, for Zion's sake, for the sake of mitzvot. Tell me instead, tell me what Judaism can do for me, what the synagogue can do for me, what the Jewish community can do for me, what mitzvot can do for me. Tell me what you can do for me, you Rabbi. Look at me in my despairing particularity, in my existential loneliness, in my deadening boredom, in my inability to celebrate, to laugh, to cry, and to feel. And the Rabbi answers him, what? Dear friends, I understand your personal needs, your anxieties, your quest for meaning and intimacy, but here in the synagogue, we're concerned with other things, with prayer and ritual observance, with study and celebration of weddings and coming of age. For what you want, you must go elsewhere. And answer Schulweis, and that is where they're going. In other words, he did not condemn them, or rather, he did not condemn us. He did not make us feel bad that we were psychological Jews. He did not condemn us. He did not make us feel guilty. If anything, he felt guilty because he understood that this was a generation that was actually crying out for something, and the synagogue wasn't answering them. They were crying out for an answer to this question of what is the meaning of my existence? Where can I find purpose? How do I find satisfaction? How do I find intimacy? How do I find friendship? Where do I find community without having to give up, without having to deal with this terrible sense that community is tearing me apart? They were looking for something, and instead of condemning them, which is what so many rabbis did and do, he said to them, let's fix the synagogue. Let's build a synagogue that heals you. The psychological Jew, in the end, is a very broken human being. Look at what he says at the bottom of this section. The psychological Jew in his private holocausts has his private holocausts. That's a very powerful phrase. And they are being ignored by the community. He is exhausted by his own envies and self-doubts, his inability to relate to his spouse, children, parents, self. Were we to give voice to his silent broodings, we would hear a half-angry, half-pleading protestation against the super-personal concerns of the community. I'll explain that phrase in a minute. Which ignore his distress. Do not tell me to support the synagogue. Tell me what the synagogue does. Tell me what the synagogue does to support me. Do not tell me to preserve Jewish continuity. Show me how it can preserve my integrity. His teacher, Mordechai Kaplan, felt that the problem with Judaism and the modernity was the idea of supernaturalism, a God who lived someplace else. Schulweis didn't think that was the problem. Here the problem is superpersonalism, a Judaism that speaks about the community and doesn't see the individual in the individual's loneliness and pain. And he started looking, and what he discovered was he wasn't the only one who noticed this. In fact, most of the great teachers, most of the great philosophers of modern Judaism, particularly Heschel and Soloveitchik and Buber, had mentioned this. Look at Heschel. This was a quotation from Heschel's essays that Schulweis kept on his desk. I mean, he talked about this all the time. Torah speaks in the language of men, plural. But the sages have overlooked the man in the Jew. They gain no insight into his difficulty and fail to understand his dilemma. Every generation has its own problems. Every man is burdened with anxieties. But the sages remained silent. They did not guide the perplexed and showed no regard for the new problems that arose. So Schulweis realizes he's talking to people that he wasn't trained to talk to. We in seminary, when I went to seminary, I went to the same seminary he did a generation later. We were taught to answer halachic questions. Ask me what time Shabbos begins and what time Shabbos is over and what's kosher and what's treif and how many walls a sukkah is supposed to have. I can tell you all of that. But nothing in my rabbinic training taught me how to talk to a person whose life is falling apart. To the woman who's just been diagnosed with breast cancer and is terrified. To the child who's devastated by the parents' divorce, to a man who's working 18, 20 hours a day and can't find any respite, and has no sense of where he is in his life. The synagogue, I was never taught, that Judaism didn't exist. And what Heschel is telling you is that it's there somewhere in the Torah, but it didn't exist, and it wasn't forefront. And what Schulweis decided to do was to make it to focus on it, to make it clear. Two things he did. Number one, change the synagogue. And number two, change the language of Judaism for this moment. So what did he do? Go to the section above, a new synagogue agenda. The psychological Jew and all of his therapeutic wisdom has backfired against him. See, the ancient person who said I was unhappy, they would try to get him back in the community. The religious person who said I was unhappy, they would try to get him back in the church. Modern people are unhappy, they go see a therapist who says, how can I make you happy? But it turns out you don't become happy that way. You become happy by reaching beyond the boundaries and borders of your subjectivity to form relationships. He wrote his master's thesis on Martin Buber in 1950, but it wasn't until 1970 that he realized what Buber was trying to tell him. That if you only live in a world of I-it, of functional transactional relationships, you have no life. It isn't until you break out of your subjectivity and live in a world of I-you that you begin to really live. Therapy is about me. Community has something else to say to me. His vaunted individualism has borne fruits of loneliness. His non-involvement in the community and its commitment and claims have resulted in nausea and boredom. Behind the mask of authenticity, of autonomy, and of self-sufficiency, and his detachedness from into a terrifying anonymity lies the longing for belonging, the craving for community and purpose. Schulweis used to joke, he said, you know what? You know, rabbis are told to answer questions. We're trained to answer. You know what question you're going to be? He told us rabbinical students, because I learned with him. He said, you know what question you're going to be asked most of all, above every other question? Rabbi, do you know my name? Do you know my name? Which is not a test of your memory of the whole synagogue roster. It's a question of, do I matter? Do I exist? Do you see me? Do you see me? That's what the congregant is asking for. But a synagogue isn't set up for that. So Schulweis decided to blow it up and start over again. Literally. The complaint that the synagogue is cold and irrelevant, which was a big complaint in 1970, and 1980, and 1990, and 2000, and 2010, and 2020, and just yesterday. The complaint that the synagogue is cold and irrelevant will not be answered from the pulpit. No, I mean, here was the greatest rabbinic orator of the world. I mean, nobody gave a speech like him. And he's like, there's no speech I'm going to give which is going to make this place better. And not from the seminary, God knows. Without the matrix of community, one cannot speak of peoplehood or of wisdom, ethics, and aspiration of a people. Without the concreteness of interpersonal relationships, the rhetoric of I-thou dialogue between person and person, between God and person, is vacuous. At best, Judaism turns into a meta-language, a way of speaking. Listen to the next line. The primary task on the agenda of the synagogue is the humanization and personalization of the temple. To overcome the interpersonal irrelevance of synagogue affiliation, that's a hell of a line, is a task prior to believing and ritual behaving. To experience true belonging is an imperative prerequisite for the cultivation of religious and moral sensibilities. Can I tell your story? Would you mind? Nancy? Your mother passed away, and you were brand new here, young mom with a kid, right? New to the community, and she'd grown up in a traditional community and needed a minyan, so she called VBS. She wasn't a member. No one knew who she was. She just called VBS and said to the rabbi, my mom died, I need a minyan. And she expected him to say, you're not a member, you owe us some money, maybe. What did he say? And he sent a minyan to her house. And she became president of the synagogue, and I'm still here. I mean, you understand what that is? Like, before we can get into, the metaphysics of God after the Holocaust, before we can talk about keeping kosher and making Shabbos, before we can talk about commitment to people, the first thing is, do I know anybody here? Anybody know my name? Anybody know who I am? Anybody know that I exist? Anybody know? So what did he do? He took the synagogue and he blew it up. Where's Sylvia? Sylvia, there was the lady who had her hand on the plunger with the dynamite. He blew it up. He said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to form groups of 10, 12 families of like station. So families with little kids, family with older kids, people without kids. And we're going to form chavurot. The word chavurah was being used for small cells. There were alternative synagogues. In Boston, in New York, in San Francisco, he decided you could do this in a shul. So we form a cell of 12 families, teach them a little about what they could do together. That was Sylvia's job, and Elaine and David's job, and Jan and Alan Schulman's job. And then let them loose with no rabbi. With no rabbi. Because they're Jews. They'll figure it out. And guess what? They did. And this Chavurot was his way of creating personal relationships within a large, impersonal institution. And the rabbi became the rabbi of the Chavurot, not the rabbi of members. At least you knew who you belonged to. You had someone to celebrate Pesach with. You had someone to be Hanukkah with. If your kid had a bar mitzvah, you knew who you were going to invite, who was going to help you set it up. And if, God forbid, there was a death in the family, you knew who was going to show up with coffee cake. By the way, the statistics bear this out. People who join a congregation, Jewish or non-Jewish, and you ask them years later, why did you stay? They'll say, because I had friends there. Nobody says the rabbi was so brilliant or good looking. Nobody says the cantor was so sweet. They'll mention it, but the reason was because I have friends there. I belong. Membership means something. I belong. I take ownership of this community. That has to become the priority, that language that he put in this, the humanization and personalization of Judaism, of the synagogue. Now, interestingly, he gave that speech. Whenever he wrote a speech, we would hear it first here. First, the board would hear it over the summer at the retreat. Then the synagogue would hear it on Rosh Hashanah. And then he would give it in various conferences and programs across the country and then publish it in Moment magazine. Right? So he started going across the country giving this speech. And wherever he went, guess how rabbis responded? Guess. What did rabbis say to him? Number one, they won't come to shul. Number two, you're going to let them do Judaism without your guidance? What if they do it wrong? Right? And they were so afraid to let go of control of this thing. Because you understand what he's saying. Give them control. And Chavurot needed to meet outside the shul. He wouldn't let them meet in the shul. And you could invite the rabbi to visit your Chavurah, but once. The rabbi wasn't going to come 10 times. You had to learn how to be Jewish. And it taught adults how to be Jewish. And it taught adults how to make relationships. And this was the first remedy to the psychological Jew. Anyone remember the TV show Cheers? Cheers was written by people who came to Valley Beth Shalom. No, it's not, but it's the idea is, no. That The Simpsons was written by people who came to Valley. That's another story. No, the idea that we all want a place where everybody knows your name. Now in Cheers, it's a bar, which is so quintessentially American, right? But the idea that there's a place I can come and I'm welcome, and a place I can come where I'm recognized, and a place where I can come and I belong, was the remedy to the ferocious loneliness of the psychological Jew. That was piece number one. So here's his answer. We are challenged to decentralize the synagogue and deprofessionalize Jewish living so that the individual Jew is brought back into the circle of shared Jewish experience. My experience with the Chavurization of the synagogue strengthens my conviction that we can help the psychological Jew meet his genuine needs for autonomy and help overcome his depersonalization by providing a way toward authentic community. You have to get over their fear of community, their fear of commitment. And the only way to get over their fear of commitment is to start very slowly. Come one Saturday night a month. We'll sit together. We'll talk. And slowly you overcome that fear of connection, that fear of commitment. You show people that the great Jewish wisdom articulated in Genesis, Lo tov heyot adam levado, you're not meant to live alone. That the claims on you from relationship do not diminish your selfhood. Claims on you from relationship elevate your selfhood. You are a bigger person because the circle of your concern and care, the circle of the claims on you, are bigger. And that religion is about expanding that beyond the narrow confines of your ego. He taught us a new Jewish language, a Jewish language of community. But there was more. The second piece of this was to teach a new Jewish language altogether. Turn to the last page. He used to make a quip. And the quip was that when I stand in the sanctuary, people always say, Rabbi, keep it short. But when they come to see me in the study, when they come to see me in my study, nobody ever says, Rabbi, keep it short. How come? Because in the sanctuary, it's about us. In the study, it's about me. So he says, in the study, I understand the limits of sanctuary culture. The individual has been lost sight of. Vicarious living won't do it. Vicarious prayers won't do it. Vicarious identity. Vicarious means someone else does it for you. Someone else does it for you. I cannot define his Jewishness on the basis of his ancestry or his descendants. I cannot help them spiritually by telling them be Jewish out of respect for Zayda or be Jewish out of respect for your children. Proxy religion will not do. Quotational Judaism will not do. I have learned from them you will not live Jewishly through your ancestors or through your children. That is a remarkable statement for a 1970s Jew. Because in 1970s, that's what it was. In 1970s, and now too, by the way, I'm Jewish because I joined the synagogue because I want my kids to have a bar mitzvah. Or I joined the synagogue and my greatest Jewish memory is my Zayda. But what's your Jewish life like? It's irrelevant. I just have a Zayda and I have kids. And I'm just in between. And Schulweis realized that's not a basis for an identity. That's not a basis for, first of all, your kid is never going to want to be Jewish unless your kid sees you being Jewish. One of the things he loved about Havurot were the stories of the kids who would peek out of their bedrooms as the grown-ups were making Havdalah. Because it was the first time the kids saw grown-ups doing Jewish without a rabbi leading them. And the first time kids saw grown-ups doing Jewish without it being for the sake of the kids. They were doing it for their own sake. For their own sake. So he says you can't be Jewish because you're kids, and you can't be Jewish for your Zayda. The question is, does Jewish speak to you? Does it have something to say to you? Right? Sam Levinson, who was the great humorist, once wrote, when I was a child, I used to do what my parents wanted. Now I'm a parent, I do what my children want. My problem is, when do I do what I want? I imbibe from my studies, secular and religious, a winking condescension to poetry. So one of the things the rabbi developed was a new regard for the emotions, for poetry, for the inner life. Schulweis, who is a profound rationalist. I mean, I can't tell you how rational he is. I can tell you how rational he is. It was painful to have lunch with him. Because you went to lunch. You know how you go to lunch and you make small talk? You know, how do you like, who's going to make it to the Super Bowl? And I like that new car you're driving. And how's your wife feel? He would make no small talk. You would sit down and his first question to me was, have you read Buber? And I said, yeah. I said, good, let's talk Buber. And that's what it was. It was was so up in his head. He was so cerebral. And he discovered that that's Judaism in the modern age, but what was happening there was this cerebral quality of Judaism that he had been trained in was a way of either masking or escaping from a deep hole in the soul. And one of the ways to reach the hole in the soul was poetry. One of the ways was to talk emotions. One of the ways was to cover the Jewish heart and the Jewish head. Look at the last one. Your heart has wisdom. Your heart can teach. Now, there's a double entendre here, I will tell you, that the moment that this became evident to him was 1983, when he had his first heart attack. And then 1986, when he had the second heart attack. And then 1993, when he had the second bypass operation. So when he's talking about the heart, he died of heart issues. I mean, he lived with heart issues from 1983 till his death in 2014. So when he's talking about the heart, he means it in a double entendre. But coming face to face with death changed him. It really changed him. And he began to understand what people were trying to tell him when they came to see him in his study. Talk to me, Rabbi. Talk to my sadness. Talk to my fear. Talk to my loneliness. Talk a Jewish idiom. Talk that Jewish idiom. And so that's what he does. He creates a new Jewish idiom. A new way of talking. Many of you remember the services he used to give. It was an interesting model. I've taken it on a little bit, but I'm not as kosher as he is. You'd go to high holiday services, and the prayer would last 3 minutes, and then the explanation of the prayer lasted 33 minutes. Right? I mean, because the idea was he understood that these were prayers that spoke to the heart, but they spoke in an idiom that wasn't ours, and he wanted to translate it. And frankly, that was one of his incredible geniuses, to translate the impersonal language of Torah, of halacha, of Talmud, into the personal language of people whose lives were broken, of people whose lives were wanting, of people whose hearts were open. And that's what he did. So this is his statement. This was close to the end of his life. Your heart has wisdom. The heart can teach. What can you learn from emotion, intuition, feelings, temperament? Nothing except some of the most important decisions of your life and mine are matters of the heart. Whether to marry, whom to marry, when to marry, what kind of friends to cultivate and learn to keep, what kind to avoid, what vocation and what profession to pursue and what not to seek. What kind of life, what meaning, what purpose do we choose? How much Judaism do you put in your home? All matters of heart and wisdom. There are two sanctuaries in us, mind and heart. When they are split apart, the twin tablets are shattered. When they are united, mind and heart give birth to wisdom. This is Jewish wisdom. What he endeavored to do through the end of his life, from 1983 on, was to create a new Jewish language that spoke to the individual and spoke to the heart. Programmatically, because he loved programs. He was addicted to programs. First, it was the counseling center. The idea that we would have an in-house counseling center where Jews would offer guidance to other Jews. And then it was this idea of para-rabbinics, where we would share our life cycle rituals. But more than programmatically, it was the idea that you can't keep talking the language of the community. In the Talmud, they call this Reshutei Arabim. You can't keep talking the language of us. You've got to learn how to talk the language of me and you. You've got to learn how to talk to the existential needs, the emotional needs of a community at this point. And that he truly believed that Judaism can survive because Judaism had a truth, had a deep and abiding truth for how to live a life that mattered. Had a deep and abiding truth for how to live a life with purpose. Had a deep and abiding truth to how to live a life that was transcendent in its value. But we needed a new idiom, a new way, a new communication of those values, of those ways of looking at the world, of those ideas that fit this particular moment. And that's the task of his Jewish philosophy. That's how he saw the Jewish people that he taught. Next week, we'll do questions in just a minute, but in case you have to go to the restroom. Next week, I want to take up with you the most powerful question that he had to deal with in the realm of philosophy and theology was, how do you talk about God after Auschwitz? And how do you talk about God in modernity? Let's take a few minutes and get a few questions, and then before Ben and Jerry's closes, we'll leave so we can go get some ice cream. Questions, comments, counter sermons. In the back, Brian.
As far away as possible, right? Thank you, Rabbi. It's wonderful. You mentioned a lot of his philosophy is a reaction to Jewish life at the time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So how has Jewish life changed since then, and what do you think he would say about it now?
Can we do that another session? Is that? That's a really interesting question, and I can't give it justice, but I'll give you just a sketch, okay? He was born in 1925, came of age during the war, and became a young rabbi during the 50s, and became a power in the Jewish community in the 70s and 80s. By the 1990s, something changed. And what changed was the ethos of the zeitgeist, the ethos of the community. In the 50s and the 60s, science was going to save us. Monsanto said, better living through chemistry. I don't know how many of you remember the Carousel of Progress at Disneyland that was once at the 1964 World's Fair. It's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow, shining at the end of every day. It's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just hang in a minute. This was an exhibit put on by General Electric at the 1964 World's Fair that was then transferred to Disneyland. And it showed the decades of the 20th century and how each decade General Electric made life so much better. And we believed it. We believed it in the 1960s and the 1970s. By the mid-'80s and the 90s, we didn't believe it so much anymore. A whole bunch of things beat that out of us. The recognition of the Holocaust beat that out of us. The Vietnam War beat that out of us. Various economic ups and downs, the race issue in America beat that out of us. And suddenly, by the 1980s and 1990s, progress wasn't inevitable anymore the way it had been in the 1960s. And science wasn't always our friend the way it was in the 1950s and 1960s. And people began looking for other ways of finding meaning in life besides economic development and science and progress. And then what happened was a shift in the culture. I'll give you an example. For Mordechai Kaplan, who was the great teacher of Judaism through the 50s and 60s, the word spirituality was a bad word. It was a derogatory term. It meant mysticism, which meant superstition. We wanted reasonable religion, rational religion. We didn't want mystical superstition. By the 1970s, late 70s, and 80s and 90s, with the counterculture among young Jews, and a new questioning of technology, and a new questioning of progress, people began to say, I'm looking for something inside, and I'm going to call that spirituality. And spirituality came back into our vocabulary, looking for something more emotional and less rational, looking for something more mystical and less cerebral, looking for something more emotional, more communal. People changed what they were looking for. Their values began to change. And Schulweis began to find himself not able to communicate with that generation as he used to, because he was so cerebral in so many ways. I mean, we'll talk about this in our third session of what he did to Judaism. But the times changed. The times began to change. And he changed too, and I'll talk about that in our last session. But so there was a shift in the Jewish world. Mordechai Kaplan, who was the principal philosopher of the 50s, of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and early 60s, gave way to Abraham Heschel, who was really Hasidic and mystical. Hasidism came back into Judaism. Lots of things changed in Jewish life and in American life. And his way of thinking, his basic observations about the psychological Jew are still true. They're still true. And the idea of speaking to the inner life is even more true than he could have guessed it. The problem was he didn't quite have the vocabulary for knowing how to do it because he was so cerebral, right? So those of us who were his younger students began to take his ideas and move them even farther. So I would say that it's not that he became obsolete. It's just that we moved past him. We took his ideas and moved it farther, moved it faster, moved it beyond where he was at the end of his academic career, and continued to carry on some of the same kinds of themes. And we'll talk about this I know that's very obscure. We'll talk about this in the third session. Okay? Would that be okay? Thanks. Another question? Anything at all? I'm sorry. Yeah, he was on 60 Minutes because, and we'll talk about this next week, one of his projects, well, let me tell you the story, and I'll tell it again next week so you'll be familiar. And he was a rabbi in Oakland. He was very involved in Jewish community life, and he was at a dinner for the Jewish Federation at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. And the owner of the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco was Swig? Yeah, Benjamin Swig, who called him aside and said, I want you to meet somebody. And the guy they wanted to meet was this giant, big guy in a coverall who was the maintenance director of the Fairmont Hotel, a man named Fritz Graber. And Fritz Graber was a German national. And Swig tells Graber, tell the rabbi your story. And so Graber tells Rabbi Schulweis, I'm German. I was a member of the Nazi Party before the war. And I was a contractor, and I had a construction company. And as the war began, I got these huge contracts to build armaments, to build all kinds of fortifications in the east end of Germany and Poland. And I began to see what my government was doing in Poland. And he got sick of it. It made me sick that the great German nation, which was so humanistic, the nation of Beethoven and Goethe and Schiller, was beginning a campaign of mass murder. And what Fritz Graber did was he told the Germans he needed laborers. Sounds like Schindler's List, only it's bigger than Schindler's List. He started taking Jews off of trains and out of ghettos and putting them into his construction projects. And when he had too many Jews for the construction projects, he began just moving them around Eastern Europe. So they were elusive. The Nazis couldn't find them. And by the height of the war, he had 5,500 Jewish people under his protection, because as long as they were employed in his company, the Nazis wouldn't touch him. And then as the war came to a close, the Nazis caught on, and they tried to arrest Graber. And he ran across the lines and gave himself up to the American army. And the American army arrested him and were about to put him in a prisoner camp when they realized who he was and what he did, so they brought him to America. And then he became an agent of the